Thank you so much for all of you being here, and welcome to Cranbrook Academy of Art, the Saal Auditorium. This is a program sponsored by the Fiber Department here, and so it's with much pleasure that I want to introduce our guest. Elena Kanagy-Loux. Lux's research into global lace history and the lives of lace makers is grounded in her own experience as a maker. After earning a BFA in Textile Design from FIT, she won a grant which funded a 4-month trip to study lace making across over a dozen European countries. Upon returning to New York City, she co-founded Brooklyn Lace Guild, an organization dedicated to the preservation of making lace by hand. She also began teaching bobbin lace classes. In 2018, she completed her MA in Costume Studies at NYU, where she based her thesis on field research conducted on her European travels. She also began working as the collection specialist at the Antonio Ratti Textile Center at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She was commissioned to create special bobbin lace designs for the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 2018 and for the BGC exhibition Threads of Power. She also was commissioned to create experimental lace reconstruction to the EU-funded project Refashioning the Renaissance. She has contributed to research and events in conjunction with exhibitions at the Yale Center for British Art, the Dallas Museum of Art, the Baltimore Museum of Art, the American Folk Art Museum, and more, and lectures widely on lace for students of textiles and fashion. She is currently working on a Ph.D. focused on the history of lace making at Bard Graduate Center. My name is Joanne Quiñones, the head of the Fiber Department, and it is a pleasure to have you all here and have Elena with us.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to Joey for inviting me and to Cranbrook and all of the wonderful students that I've been working with for the past 2 days. I can't believe how fast our workshop went, but it was so delightful. And thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm like, wow, that makes me sound so fancy. I don't feel that fancy, but it's been really an honor to be doing this research. So where I like to begin, I'll be talking. As you can see, I have many different facets and approaches to my work, and I'm sure many of you relate to the feeling that trying to put yourself into a singular category as an artist, a maker, a designer, a historian, etc., feels like an impossible task. And so it also felt like an impossible task to put only one facet of my work into this presentation. So I'm going to be exploring historical research, my personal journey into lace making, and my research projects, my personal research projects that are ongoing. So it's many things. Okay, so bear with me. So I like to start out with just a question that seems very simple but gets more complicated for me to answer with each passing day, which is, what is lace? And my working definition is that lace is a textile in which the pattern is defined by the spaces between the threads. And so this is because lace, unusually for textiles, does not have one sort of technical categorization that you can fit it within. For example, in weaving, which was my specialty prior to lace making, and I still love weaving, of course, you have at least the perpendicular warp and weft and some kind of loom, whether it is backstrap, heddle, floor loom, warp-weighted loom, whatever, tablets. But you have this sort of perpendicular warp and weft structure in common. But in lace, we don't really have that. In fact, the two most predominant kinds of lace making that you will find in lace history publications and things like that, needle and bobbin lace that I'll talk about at length, are made completely differently, but yet can be indistinguishable at times. So just to start, I like to include these images because the one on the right is sort of the floral tool ground Chantilly lace that we might envision lace to look like. But this is really a much later sort of 19th century development. Whereas on the, sorry, did I say on the right? That's what I meant. I'm not good at left and right, which is hilarious because lace making involves so much left and right, but proof that you can still do it if you can't remember left and right. So, and then on the left is punto in aria, is a type of Italian needle lace. It's the earliest form of true needle lace, and the name means stitches in air because you're literally stitching into the air. This is one of my favorite pieces that we'll come back to, but just to say that this looks very different than the kind of typical vision of lace that we have now. So just to say that it encompasses so many things. And as Thomas Fuller so eloquently put in 1662, what is lace but a little thread descanted on by art and industry? So just to say that actually, given my definition being very broad, I include many other textile techniques other than needle and bobbin lace that actually predate those developments within Europe. So, for example, Chanquet gauze in the Chanquet civilization in Peru, which lasted from about 1100 to 1450 AD, has a number of excavated archaeological examples of what is essentially, for the weavers, lino weave or gauze that has then been darned or embroidered with figural sort of graphic animal motifs and geometric motifs. And a lot of this really exquisite textile work survives from this time period. And then one of my favorite pieces in the world that I have not had the privilege to view yet, but that I hope to someday, is the Spiro Mounds lace from present-day Oklahoma that dates back to the Mississippian period. And essentially, if thanks to the structural analysis by several lace makers in the community, essentially this is a torchon lace structure. It's a bobbin lace structure. Of course, I'm sure it was made very differently with different tools, but just to say that there's only so many things that you can do with threads, and people get to open work all over the world at all different time periods. There's also the knotted lace family. So a lot of people think of fishing nets, and while fishing nets are not related to needle or bobbin lace, there are a whole family of knotted laces including Turkish oya or bibilia and Armenian janyak. And there are other laces in this family. I will just disclaim that I cannot be exhausted in any singular lecture. So I will be omitting things as much as I try to be inclusive. So don't think that don't feel neglected. There's too much to put in one presentation. Then we have macrame, which many people associate with like 70s plant holders and sort of a recent resurgence of hip macrame making, but actually dates back to, there are Assyrian examples carved in stone. Macrame is actually the Arabic word for towel because it was originally started from towel warp fringes that were knotted into increasingly elaborate examples. And these on the left are from the Renaissance. So at the same time, in the Italian Renaissance that you're seeing needle and bobbin lace evolve, as I will talk about, you're also seeing these other forms, burato, the woven laces, and macrame, the knotted laces. So there's something in the air in this time period, but there's many roots around the world in lace making. Also, spraying is a technique some of you may be familiar with that has ancient roots in the Andes, in North Africa and Egypt, and it's also made in Scandinavian countries. And the example on the right is a reconstruction of a 17th century piece of spraying that's Dutch. So this is used to make openwork structures, as well as it's a precursor to sort of knitted structures, so used for like medieval party-colored hose and things like that. And then lastly, I will include, a few more things, but there's this needle looping technique that dates to the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries in China and Central Asia that is essentially needle lace. It is buttonhole structures, and it's worked in an open structure in these patterns, these geometric patterns that resemble later Venetian patterns. And I'm not suggesting that there are links between these things, because there's no evidence for that actually, but just that human beings have this innate capacity to come up with these ideas and construct them internationally. So the last one, which is a really special example that we've talked about a little bit this couple days with the fiber students, is a really singularly unusual type of lace. It is a lace bark, and it's from the legato tree in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, Haiti, and Cuba. And this was used originally by the Taino indigenous people for things like butterfly nets and other sort of utilitarian objects, and then turned into a sort of lace by free and enslaved black women to produce these lace-like products for themselves and for sale. So there's an excellent book, thankfully, by Steve O. Buckridge about this technique. If you're interested, it's really fantastic. So there's been great research done on this really beautiful textile. And just to say that it's sort of the background of this doily on the left. It's a nature's lace. So, but because needle lace and bobbin lace are the primary focus of my research, I will talk a little bit about how those developed. So needle lace developed essentially out of cut work and drawn work embroidery. So if you look at the top right example, this is a sort of in-progress sampler of cut work and drawn work where you have your woven linen, so linen plain weave fabric, and you would trace your pattern or draw your pattern onto it and then cut and draw threads out to create voided areas and then stitch back into them. But if you can imagine, this is a time period in northern Italy in the early 16th century, late 15th maybe, where you, in order to produce a linen shirt, you need an acre of flax and you need years of labor to essentially grow the flax, ret the fiber, process it, spin it, dress the loom, weave it. So then to cut it all out and throw it away in this manner is unbelievably wasteful. So somebody figured out, well, we can just do these needle lace stitches, these buttonhole stitches, directly onto the pattern base on parchment or later on paper when that became more widely available, with outline threads. And that's when punto in aria, the stitches in air technique, developed. So you can see that on the bottom right. This is the hands of my first needle lace teacher, Marisa Situri, who I'll show a picture of later. Bobbin lace developed in tandem, but yet out of totally different technique, out of braiding techniques associated with passementerie, so the sort of gold and metal and colorful braids that would trim, for example, a military uniform or a fancy Victorian couch. So they sort of broke off and split into two different textile categories. There are still very cool passementerie makers out there. But essentially due to the need for thread management, somebody was like, well, we should just wind all these threads around bobbins, and which they already had for things like tapestry weaving. And as it became increasingly elaborate, they also introduced patterns underneath that had the design either pricked or printed onto them. And you're essentially following that pattern beneath in crossing and twisting. I'll show a video of this process later. And then the pins are inserted after you create the stitches as a sort of scaffolding to hold the tension. So this is a sort of braided or woven structure. It's like kind of off-loom weaving a little bit, but developed out of fancy braiding. And one of the reasons for the sudden and a very rapid expansion of both of these techniques, needle and bobbin lace, simultaneously within Europe in the 16th century was the proliferation of printed pattern books. Of course, printed books the Gutenberg press was invented in the 15th century, and the new introduction of these printed materials allowed techniques to be spread rapidly. So the first bobbin lace pattern books were printed by the Sessa brothers in Venice in 1557 and 1561. You can see in the middle there is an example from La Pompe Opera Nova, which is the name of the first one. And then on the left is the second ever pattern book by a Swiss woman who's only identified by her initials, RM. This is very unusual to have the designer of the lace. Usually just the publisher is identified. And this is also this is the frontispiece for her book, which is the first ever published image of a bobbin lace maker working on her pillow from Switzerland. Okay. All right, so a little bit later I'll talk about some more research into this woman, but one of the only other bobbin lace or lace pattern designers from this time period was Isabella or Elisabetta Catanea Parasole, who was a Roman engraver who initially started out working for this botanical scientist doing his scientific engravings. She married into an engraving family, the Parasole family, and she made her name and career engraving lace pattern books. So she not only designed, but also engraved them and was named, which is really incredibly unusual. She was particularly known for needle lace patterns and reticella or cut work, drawn work lace patterns, but she did a few in bobbin lace, which I did some experiments with that I will talk a little bit about. but briefly because I just published an article about them too, so I will share that information. So as I mentioned, bobbin lace, early forms of bobbin lace developed from sort of elaborate gold and silver passementerie braid. So of course, a lot of the early laces that you will find are actually in colorful threads, like the trim you see here, and in gold and silver. And this surprises people because they're used to seeing linen, but actually part of this is because a lot of the metal threads would actually be melted down at later times, so they don't necessarily survive. Also, dyed silk is a lot more fragile and doesn't last as well as white linen, so that's why the majority of surviving lace from this time period is white linen. It has become very traditional, but it has always been made in color as well. And then on the left is the first image that I've been able to find of gold bobbin lace, and they're using tapestry bobbins. It's in the bottom corner, so it's a very cool little detail. All right, so my personal interest always is in labor and in makers, because I'm a maker, and I always identify as a maker first and a historian second, because that's the order in which I've studied. So I like to talk and think about who the makers are. A lot of the history of lace gets told through the wealthy people that wore it, and that makes sense because there's much more information readily available about that kind of material. So I'm really interested in who the makers were, and it's so rare to find any depictions of lace maker studios because often they worked in, for example, in Venice, in like cloistered environments in convent schools. That's where a lot of these techniques developed. And one of the reasons that Venice is understood to be one of the earliest centers of lace making in Europe is because that they had the highest per capita number of convents and nuns in all of Europe. And this was due to their practice of basically involuntary, putting women in the convent involuntarily. So on the right is one of the very few voices of lace makers that we have from early modern Italy, Arcangela Tarabotti, who was born Elena Cassandra, which I find very, special, of course. She was actually one of 6 daughters in a noble family, born in Venice, and at age, usually how it went was, because dowries for wealthy girls were very expensive, the first 3 daughters might be married off, and then after that, they would be put into the convent because the fee was less, essentially. So she was the eldest daughter, and she was put in the convent when she was 11. So historians believe that she was physically disabled and seen as unfit for marriage, and that's why she was entered into the convent. She really fought this, and she tried very hard not to become part of it, and she is really outstanding in her, I don't want to say resilience, I feel like that's overused, but she taught herself to read and write at a time when a lot of these nuns were not trained in that way and not educated in that way, and were expected to labor and do needlework all day, and she developed correspondence with the great thinkers of the day, who were, of course, men and public figures. So she corresponded publicly with and argued publicly with philosophers about gender and feminism, essentially. She was truly groundbreaking. So she has written several books, fortunately for all of us, and several of them have been translated into English. So if you're interested, you can look for her books Paternal Tyranny and Monastic Hell, so you can see how she felt about being in the convent. And in one of them, she writes about how the nuns were forced to take up the wretched needle and bobbin and basically labor for wealthy women that were not forced into the convents. However, she also rose to be the head of the lace workshop. If you look at the archival material from the Sant'Anna convent in Giudico, where she lived, just south of Venice, essentially she then became the master lace maker and taught younger women and was responsible for exchanging enormous sums of money. This was very, very expensive. So thank you for her perspective. Then we have other young women. In Antwerp, which was another huge center of lace making. It was the focus of an excellent exhibition and catalog, Places. It was based at 5 museums in Antwerp. There's a really wonderful catalog by numerous curators So please go look it up. They've done such fantastic research. But essentially, the Plantin Moretus Museum started as a printing press, a family-run printing press by the Plantin family in the 16th century. And it is known today for being a book publisher. But actually, if you look at their records in the 16th century and the 17th century, what was the business that was making money for them and keeping them in the red was their lace business, which was run by their teenage daughters, Christine and Martine Plantin. So this is a later portrait of Martine. And so this is just fascinating and an example of how this sort of gets overlooked by historians and economists today who don't really understand how substantial lace-making was economically within history. So, even within its time period, lace and lace accessories were subject to critique by sort of traditionalists who thought that it was silly and frivolous. So you may be familiar with portraits such as this one with enormous lace ruffs. This one is worn by Elizabeth I of England, and the reason why her ruffs always look so gigantic is because she actually legislated that her ruffs should be the largest. She passed sumptuary legislation that prohibited people of lesser status and lower classes from her to wear lace at the same size. So it was mandated, and there are examples of, for example, of a gentleman whose bootlaces were too long, because this was a totally gender-neutral accessory at the time, having them chopped off. Which is, as a lace maker, and then I love seeing some of these like satirical images. The one on the right is an engraving, ironically called The Vices of Women, although it depicts men also wearing ruffs, so interesting. But essentially it's a rough goffering shop. So there were specialized laundresses. Not only was there incredible amounts of labor going into the production of lace, but also into its maintenance and laundry. And so these specialized laundresses would reset these ruffs into goffered collars. And so here we have this, this laundress that's resetting collars for these wealthy men and women, while this sort of death is behind them, signaling their mortality. But my favorite quote from this time period comes from an Englishman, Philip Stubbs, in Anatomy of Abuses, which is sort of his get off my lawn treatise of 1583, complaining about young people ruining everything, where he calls ruffs cartwheels of the devil's chariot of pride, leaving the direct way to the dungeon of hell. So you can see how he felt about them. So far we've talked about Flanders and we've talked about Italy, but we've not talked about France yet, which later became a very, very important region for lace making. And essentially, under Louis XIII, lace making was banned. Legislation was passed because French courtiers were spending so much money outside of the country to bring in Italian and Flemish lace. The ban didn't work, nobody listened. But there is a delightful poem from the perspective of the banned laces called the Revolte de Passement, or the Revolt of the Passementerie. So if you're interested, you can read it. It's very funny. The laces are all sort of dejectedly leaving France. But so under Louis XIV, he and his cultural and finance minister, Colbert, decided if we can't beat them, join them. So they established their own lace industry in France in 1665. This isn't to say that there wasn't lace making in France before, there was, but just that this was under the royal decree of the crown. And to this day, in Alençon, where they have the center of needle lace, which is what this is, and also in Le Puy-en-Velay in Auvergne, which is the center of bobbin lace, or the earliest center of bobbin lace, there are several. They still have royal schools where you can apprentice to become a lace maker and make, edgings for the prime minister's linens or something. I'm not sure, actually. But so this still exists to this day. And really, after this time period in the 17th century, the French industry sort of took over a little bit in terms of needle lace production. So this I just like to show because it's such a cool example of meta lace, where the figures in the lace are wearing their own lace. This is a period that doesn't get a lot of love in the late 17th century in period dramas, except for in The Favorite. They have these big phalanges and everyone sort of looks like a lampshade. I love it personally. but she's also has her own little lace fromage headdress here. And another example of the importance of lace making to the economy in Europe at this time is the case study of the Point d'Angleterre, or Brussels bobbin lace gown that was made for Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. So this was during the time of the Austrian monarchy, which was over many different parts of Europe, including parts of Flanders. And so when the Ghent government owed a massive debt of 25,000 guilders to the Austrian monarchy that they couldn't afford to pay, they offered instead to use the labor of their incredibly skilled lace makers to produce a gown for her in this technique, which took something like 50 lace makers 7 months to produce. And they painted 2 portraits in it of her in this gown, one which is still in the Ghent Municipal Archives building, and one which is in her palace in Vienna. And so this gown was never really recorded again. There was, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but there was a gentleman at her court who basically wrote one of those diaries that historians love, where he recorded every boring detail that ever happened. So he wrote down every single outfit Maria Theresa wore every day, and he never wrote about this gown ever again. So what we think possibly, and there's been great publications about this by Dr. Michael Yonan in California, what we think possibly happened is that the gown was so valuable, this lace was so valuable and so incredibly labor intensive, that it was immediately like taken apart and given away as like diplomatic gifts. So all that remains that we know of is this sleeve from the collection of the Met. And you can tell that it's from this garment because it has this incredibly massive scale and patterning that's based more off of like silk designs than typical lace designs, which are very small. And this debt would have been the equivalent of like millions of dollars today, and this is the only case this early of like a lace gown. Everything else you hear about is accessories because they're so labor intensive to produce. Could be years for a single collar. So, okay. So now we've talked about Europe, and I want to move into a little bit of the rest of the world, because in fact, as early as lace making was happening in Europe, it was also happening in the European colonies and was quickly adapted to different regional varieties and has become parts of a huge number of treasured local traditions. So in the US, in New England, the Ipswich lace industry, the earliest records in Massachusetts date back to the 1630s of lace coming into New England with, there was a case in the 1650s of an indentured servant in the house in a household that accused a governor's son of assault, and she explained that this happened while she was working at her lace cushion. So this is how we know this. And then in the 1780s, Alexander Hamilton was tasked with assembling a manufacturing report from the 13 states at the time, including the Ipswich lace industry. So according to his report from 1791, 600 lace makers made 41,979 yards of lace worth 1869 pounds and 10 pence in Ipswich that year. So his report also includes 36 samples of lace, some of which are depicted here, and there's been some great research on this, not only by Karen Thompson at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in DC, but also by the New England Lace Guild, which one of the members, Mary Magnan, who has been so phenomenal in pioneering Wikipedia edit-a-thons. I know that we, as academics, don't sometimes look down at Wikipedia, but actually putting information on there as the first place that people go to look is so fantastic. So there is now, thanks to Mary, a Ipswich lace page on Wikipedia. So please consider, if you are an expert in any field, putting in your knowledge onto Wikipedia for other people to benefit from. So, or hosting an edit-a-thon, honestly. So, later in US history, in the 1890s, the Sybil Carter Indian Lace School was established by an Episcopalian missionary, Sybil Carter, in the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota initially. Then this expanded all over the United States, including locations in the Oneida and Ojibwe nations in Wisconsin, which will be actually one of the case studies of my research, because they were interested in laces from the Italian Renaissance and were copying them. This is obviously a very fraught and very problematic industry because Sybil Carter's intentions were to sort of, as she describes it, quote, civilize indigenous women. And so it has a very problematic intentions associated with it. But I will say that in the Oneida School, in that particular instance, it's the only example where they had a Native American instructor who actually did not learn from the Sybil Carter School, but from an HBCU in Virginia. Her name was Josephine Hill, and she continued the tradition after Sybil Carter's death, and it became an important part of the community, and there are still lace makers there today. So just to say that these things are complicated, but they do take root and continue to have meaning once they are adopted and adapted by a community. In the Spanish Americas, there's so much lace that I could not possibly get into it, but I was particularly interested for a recent research project, because my dissertation project focuses on a Mexican-American woman, in looking into bobbin lace making in Mexico, based on having seen some of these really incredible polychrome wool bobbin lace trims on colchas or bed coverings that you can see an edging of here. And so I recently gave a talk at the Textile Society of America about these and some reconstruction research that will be published in the proceedings. So I won't talk too much about it, but just to say this is really something that takes root and becomes adopted into indigenous colorways and practices and things like that. So here's another example with my diagram beside it. And this is very technical, but just to say that looking at the edging, it looked far more like the sort of like 90-degree angle grid torchon lace that we were making in our class today. But actually, once I did the diagram, I realized this is unbelievably elaborate, and it really looks and resembles more like the Flemish Antwerp-style laces that are really technically complicated that were being exported by the Spanish from Flanders during this time period. So, but adapted into these really incredible and beautiful colors. So further research necessary, but this is just a side avenue of interest that I encourage other people to research as well. And then some places where lace making is flourishing as well. In Brazil, a researcher friend, Ana Andrade, has been doing her master's at Oxford, researching lace from where she is from in Brazil, in the northeastern region. So that still continues as an active practice after being introduced by the Portuguese, and includes so many colorful varieties and techniques that really resemble Tupinamba featherwork, if you're familiar, if you've seen the sort of incredible featherwork capes. One was just repatriated from Denmark. So, and they use tools like Brazil nut bobbins and palm leaf stuffed pillows and things, and cactus thorns for pins that are very, very localized. Also in Paraguay, there is Nyanduti lace, which is it's a needle lace worked in the round, and this is it's the Guarani, the indigenous language name for spider's web. So it really looks like these gorgeous, colorful spider's webs. And then another friend, Kusuni Rathnasuria, who is a member of my guild, Brooklyn Lace Guild, she is from Sri Lanka, and she works with lace makers in southern Sri Lanka for her clothing brand, Kerr Collection. So these practices still continue after hundreds of years. Just to move into the 19th century, we have talked about needle lace and bobbin lace primarily. We have not talked about the sort of later developing laces. So of course, in the 19th century, we have the introduction of lace machines. And with this comes really an intense interruption of a lot of these industries. And what happens is, first of all, a lot of these industries are exported from Europe, where the labor is no longer affordable and competitive, to different colonies around the world, but also other techniques are innovated to sort of compete with machines that are a little bit, relatively speaking, faster for production. So one of these is the crochet lace industry, which really develops in tandem with the Irish famine in Ireland. So a lot of these techniques are coming out of dire need and really the incredibly brilliant and skilled innovation of women who are figuring out how to support themselves and their families. So this develops into a massive industry in Ireland. There are many other kinds of lace as well, but they are most well known for their crocheted lace. And then these industries are also introduced around the world. So in India as well, they have the crochet lace industry that still produces lace in Narsapur, and there's a really great book by Marissa Mies about this, the lace makers of Narsapur, that I really, really recommend if anyone is interested in learning more about that. Then we also have tatting. So tatting is often associated with these sort of like 18th century portraits of, like the one on the right here, of this woman holding, it's actually a young Marie Antoinette holding a silver shuttle, but this is much larger than would be used for tatting. This is actually a knotting shuttle, so these were used to make knots, and that were then woven into fly fringes on little box looms. So there may be some relationship between knotting and tatting, but technically this has not been resolved yet. There still needs to be more research done, and tatting as a lace technique really also corresponded with this sort of Irish famine period, and so you start to see this emerge because it is slightly faster than needle and bobbin lace. So as I said, I'm very interested in the stories of lace makers, and they can be really difficult to uncover because many of them were in fact illiterate or didn't leave behind written records of their feelings. And there's also, to combat, a lot of imagery of lace makers that is very sort of idealized, these idealized domestic images, like genre paintings like the one on the left here, which I love, from the Metz collection of The Lace Maker by Nicolas Mas. And it shows what is described, often described, as a mother and child. But if you look more closely at her clothing and you understand sort of what was happening in Dutch culture in this time period, it is pretty quick that you recognize that actually this is a servant. This is a household servant. The mother of the household wouldn't be wearing wool, red wool with the sleeves rolled up. She would probably be wearing black silk. This is more a typical servant's outfit. And also, a lot of these portraits are staged, and they depict singular women working on their own, which is why we have this impression of lace making as sort of a hobby activity of wealthy women. But that was not to say that that never happened, but that was really the minority, if that makes sense. So what is much more rare is to see images like the one on the right. This is a painting, a really incredible survivor as part of a triptych by the Flemish painter Jacob Jordaens. I think it's from the 1640s. And he painted 3 different images of the Magden House in Antwerp, which is an orphanage. And it was founded in the 1530s essentially to educate young women and girls, to help them get work in domestic service or to go into to earn money for dowries. I think one of the things that surprises people a lot to hear is that in early modern Europe, the average age of marriage was really, for women, about 26, and for men was about 28. This is pretty consistent. And the reason we have an idea of people getting married super young is based on the aristocracy and the royalty, because they were the ones that were getting married as part of negotiations for political reasons, essentially. But working class and poor people, who were the majority of people, had to earn money to create a home, essentially. So a lot of girls would go into service or go into schools and orphanages where they would learn a trade, and men as well, or work on their family's farm or business until they could save enough money for marriage. So this is much more of a common thing. So by the 17th century, the Flemish lace industry was hugely important. This is also extensively covered in the Places catalog that I mentioned earlier from the exhibition in Antwerp. So they had basically stopped teaching them anything other than lace making, and it had really become more of a sweatshop. So that's at the time period when this is shown. And even though it's called an orphanage, you can see also here parents bringing their children who can't afford to keep them at home. So it's not necessarily children without family, but children whose family couldn't afford to care for them. And in the back, we have all of these girls making lace. And they were just unbelievably and incredibly skilled. And really, this is much more of a professional industry than we like to think about it. And there's been a lot of research questions in sort of what is domestic, what is professional, how do we define these terms? So that is a lecture for another time. But one of the really wonderful sources that we have for lace makers' lives and the joy that they had in their lives is from lace makers' songs and tells. And a lot of this work has been documented, first of all, in a book by Thomas Wright called The Romance of the Lace Pillow, but also more recently by Dr. David Hopkins at Oxford in a project called Lace in Context by the Poor for the Rich, where he writes about all kinds of folk culture of lace makers. Lace makers had patron saints in different regions. Our guild celebrates St. Catherine's Day on November 25th, where we jump over candlesticks and we drink mead, and there's all these festivities associated with it. And then there's, in Flanders, they celebrated St. Anna's Day, so this is a portion of one of their songs where they basically say, my cushion to the gallows, my bobbins to the pillory. I wish that every day could be St. Anna's, because this is the day they got to party, essentially. There are also records of lace tells that lace makers would chant while they were working, and often these were repetitive. And if you recall that many of these professional lace makers were children because they had the best eyesight, actually, they were kind of like nursery rhymes a lot of times, and sometimes they were a little naughty, and sometimes they were about who's going to be my boyfriend, and they're very charming, so definitely look up The Romance of the Lace Pillow and David Hopkins' work. Okay, so speaking of stories, because I don't want to run way too over time, I will tell you a little bit about my own story now. So just to say that to quickly summarize, I have the kind of history of my life where I didn't know that I was going to become a lace historian when I was kind of figuring myself out as a young adult and a young person. But now looking back, I'm like, oh yeah, I was always headed this way. So my ancestry, my grandparents were Amish and Mennonites, and on my mother's side, they became missionaries to Japan. So then I grew up between Japan and the US. So I have this sort of, I grew up sewing, crocheting, quilting, doing all of these things just as a standard part of life. And I didn't really think of it as like art because no one taught it to me that way. I ended up going into fashion in New York City and doing design for celebrities like Courtney Love and things like that. But I realized that I really couldn't stand working in the industry and the competitiveness and all of that sort of thing, and that I was actually much more interested in history. So in 2012, I went back to school at FIT, and I was interested in lace making. I actually Googled, I was a weaver, and lace was something on my bucket list that I thought, well, I'll just try this once and see how I feel. So I ended up Googling lace school, and the first one that came up was in Slovenia. So I went there in 2012, which you'll see in the next slide. But also on this trip, I also paid a pilgrimage to Burano in Venice, where I was fortunate to be actually about a week ago. So this is where needle lace making really was in huge quantities being produced starting in the 16th century outside of Venice. It's a really beautiful island. They have a great museum. And since I first visited in 2012 and 2015, they've actually now reintroduced lace workshops. So please go visit and take a workshop with them. They're the best. Then I went to Slovenia, where I went to their lace festival. This is, as I have mentioned in my classes a few times, the lace race. So this is where the children at the elementary school in the village, which used to be a lace school and is now a day school with lace classes in the afternoon and evening, where they make lace. And so for the festival, they give them all a pattern. I think they're starting here, so they all have their bobbins wound, and they have to, whoever makes their lace the fastest and gets it off the pillow wins. But it takes like hours, so you can walk around, buy some thread, have a beer, it's very fun. Then I had trouble continuing because I didn't have an instructor in New York City, so I returned on a grant through my alma mater, FIT, in 2015, as Joey mentioned, going to over a dozen countries. So this is just a survey. The first stop was in Lepoglava, Croatia, at their lace festival. It was also my honeymoon. So this is my husband taking a lace class on our honeymoon. He did excellent. He works in fashion, so we only do lace travel together, and he is totally into it, which is really wonderful for me. And then I went back to Idrija, and I took another class at the lace school here. This is the oldest still continuing lace school in Europe. It was actually founded under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so it's very, very cool. Then I went back to Burano, where I had seen on my first visit, essentially, lace makers, while they didn't have classes, they had lace makers working in shops. So I contacted one of the shops, Martina Vidal, and I said, hey, can you just organize a workshop for me? So this is my lace teacher. My first needle lace class, Marisa Situri, teaching me how to make needle lace in Burano. And I later learned that the Lace Museum in Burano, it was formerly a school for lace that closed in the 70s that Marisa had attended. She had been making lace for about 60 years at this time. And the lace school was founded in the 1890s, 1892, after the lagoon froze, and basically the fishermen couldn't go out and they needed money. So the Queen Margarita helped to sponsor and reestablish the lace school because there was one surviving lace maker, basically, that had still learned in the pre-industrial way. So it really just takes one person for these things to happen. And so now I realize I have this direct lineage back that I learned there too, from a teacher that also studied the school, and the school, so it just blows your mind sometimes. Then I studied lace identification and squeezed in some velvet weaving at Fondazione Eliseo in Florence. Highly recommend if you have the chance to go. I visited the Rapallo Lace Museum and the Emilio Gandolfi Lace Shop in Italy. And just to say, along the way, I was interviewing these lace makers and also shop owners. The shop owner of the Gandolfi Lace Shop was the 4th generation, and at the time, in 2015, he said they were just trying to reach their 100th anniversary and then they were going to shutter because they really just didn't have business anymore. And they did, in fact, make it to 2019 to their 104th anniversary or something, which was very exciting, but then they unfortunately have closed recently. I also visited Vicenza, where I went to a craft fair with lace makers doing knotted netting, laces techniques from Sicily, and Orvieto crochet lace on the left. I studied tape lace in Luxeuil-les-Bains in France, which used to be the site of like a luxurious bath that fell out of fashion. So they picked up the sort of Battenberg tape lace technique that they're very proud that Empress Eugenie wore in the Second Empire. And then I studied at the school in Le Puy-en-Velay in France. This is where the sort of earliest roots of lace making, of bobbin lace making in France are, that date back to the 16th century. And this is where the sort of lace school of the that is still run by the apprenticeship by the Royal Institution of, I forget what it's called in English. Anyway, so they still have this apprenticeship program there for lace making, and they have a fantastic lace school if you are ever interested. Great cheese, great wine, medieval village, what more could you want? In the neighboring village in Brieude, they have the Hôtel de la Dentelle, where they specialize in these polychrome little leaf shapes or tallies that are called point d'esprit. You make hundreds of them. So if, as a lace maker, you feel intimidated by this technique, which many do, but you shouldn't, you just have to make 100, as my Swedish lace teacher said, and then you'll never forget how to do it. And that sounds like a lot, but it's not. So you just have to go to Brieude and study tallies with them. Then I went to Barcelona to the Asociació de Puntaires. Many of these places didn't necessarily have workshops for outsiders. They just had weekly workshops for locals. So they really made me like custom workshops, which was really incredible. And this is my teacher, Pilar. This is what a Spanish lace pillow looks like. So it's very tall and cylindrical and leans against the table. So it's really good for your back. The problem is all your bobbins sort of clump down together, so it's harder to stay organized, but very cool. Then, of course, I had to go to Belgium, as you do, to Bruges, where I studied at Centrum at the Rococo Lace Manufactory, and I interviewed the owner of the Rococo Lace Manufactory, which is one of the few shops left in Belgium that still sells some handmade lace locally. And I don't know if any of you have seen this viral video of a woman in a burgundy sweater vest in a yellow background making lace really, really, really fast. But her name is Germaine, and that is filmed at Centrum in this room. I tried to include my video of her wearing the same burgundy sweater vest, in fact, from a different day, but the same year. But it wouldn't embed. I'm sorry about that. It's a huge file, so I think my computer was like not having it. So, but ask me later. Anyway, so my goal for this project, this grant-funded project, was three-pronged. One, to learn how to make lace, of course, in all these different schools. Two, to interview lace makers along the way, which later became my master's thesis at NYU. And then three, to form a lace guild. And believe it or not, that was the one that I was most afraid to do. I did not think that anyone in New York was going to be interested or that anyone was going to show up. But in fact, at our first meeting of Brooklyn Lace Guild in 2016, so next year is our 10-year anniversary, 10 people showed up, and now we have 64 members. We're very active. We're on Instagram. We just had our first exhibition, which I'll show you a slide of, and I'm going to grab my water really fast because I forgot to bring it to the podium. So 1 second. Sorry about that. As you can imagine, teaching a lace workshop, I've been talking and talking and talking all day, so. All right, so Brooklyn Lace Guild has been really such a joy, and there's so many wonderful members doing really incredible work. This photo is from one of our lace days at the Old Stone House in Brooklyn, where we just had our exhibition. So please check us out, check them out. And we have virtual meetings if anyone's interested as well. So in 2018, Brooklyn Lace Guild got an email from Columbia Law School asking to have a meeting with us. And I thought, well, that's very strange. What would a law school want with a lace guild? But of course, I was curious, so I agreed to talk to them. And they said, you know, we are trying to commission a lace collar for the 25th anniversary of the investiture of our alumna, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, to the Supreme Court. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm so totally not qualified to do this. I have never designed lace before. I have never done a lace commission before. And having worked in the fashion industry where I was exclusively doing commissions, I always thought, when I learned to make lace, I was like, I would never do this as a commission. It would be way too hard. It'd be way too much work. So I asked everyone else in the guild, like, hey, would you want to do this commission? And nobody had time, nobody was interested, or, you know, didn't feel up for it, so I was like, well, okay, I have to do this. So I worked with their creative director, Cara Van Warden, to come up with a design with the 25s all around. And this was made in cotton with a silk gimp or outline thread, and it took me 300 hours to complete. You know, I'm not as fast as a 17th century lace maker, but still, it's very labor intensive. And so this was presented to her in 2018. After this, this was after I completed my master's, and it also overlapped with the start of my position at the Antonio Ratti Textile Center, which is the study and storage collection of the Met's textile collection from 12 different curatorial departments. So it's not in itself a curatorial department, but it stores for them. So actually, this is the coverlet from the Mexican colcha that has the bobbin lace trim in the corner here. I didn't even make that connection. But so it houses 5,000 pieces of lace, and this is where I got the sort of inspiration for my dissertation project working there that I'll talk about briefly in a little bit. I also was then commissioned to do a project for the Refashioning the Renaissance project. This was a project which studies working and artisan class people's dress from the early modern Europe, because of course those don't survive in museum collections. It's really unusual. So you have to use other forms of data and information in order to reconstruct these things. So I reconstructed a handkerchief, which I'll show you in a moment, with 4 different edgings that represented 4 different time periods between quarter-century periods between 1550 and 1650 that sort of tracked the development and the complexity and the labor involvement of lace making in northern Italy. So this is a reconstruction of a piece in the Met's collection that I dated to approximately 1575 to 1600 in silk and linen. And here is a video of its production. So for all 4 edgings, I really meticulously tracked to the minute the time that everything took to produce. I either hand drew the designs that I worked on, or I worked in one case on top of a Renaissance pattern book by the aforementioned designer Isabella Cattanea Parasole. And in this case, I hope this, maybe I'll jump ahead past the, come on, oh, there we go. But so I discovered that essentially from the earliest period, when the first example using gold thread, gold metal thread, that where the value of the lace would have been based on the materials, by the end of this time period, for the same amount of lace took 30 times longer and using linen thread. So arguably this illustrates that lace had now become something expensive based on labor rather than materials. So, all right, I don't want to stick too long on here. So let's see. Oops. Next one. Okay, so this was the most elaborate example. This is the last one. So this is actually an extant handkerchief in the Met's collection that I reconstructed, like so. This took between 5 and 7 hours per scallop. And I won't give you too many details on this because, in fact, this is the final completed handkerchief with all 4 edgings. Both of this 2 articles about this project have just been published this month, so you're in luck. I keep telling people they're coming, and they really are. So there's a book, Refashioning the Renaissance, that came out 3 days ago, and then I think 2 weeks ago, or even less, an article, there's a special issue of Textile History Journal that is open access online, fully available, do not have to have academic credentials to access, which was very important to us. We wanted this research to be accessible. And there's such cool stuff in there, so please check it out. After this commission project, like how I said I would not do commissions, and now here I am. I was approached by Bard Graduate Center around the same time, in 2021, I believe, that they were working on an exhibition called Threads of Power, lace from the Textile Museum St. Gallen in Switzerland, that was coming in 2022. And so not only did I consult on the exhibition and I helped to curate the programming, but we also, Brooklyn Lace Guild, these are some of our members, had a gallery on the top floor where we had a lace maker studio. So after people walked up all the flights looking at historic lace, they could see how it was made on the top floor, which was incredible. It was a wonderful experience. And they also commissioned me to make the piece to open the exhibition. So I knew immediately that I wanted to take inspiration from my favorite piece of lace in the Met's collection that has a sibling in the Textile Museum St. Gallen collection. This is not unheard of. Sometimes there are a few pieces of one lace design that are slightly different in different collections. So this is it's the story of Judith and Holofernes in Punto Anadia needle lace that we saw in the first slide. So these are the sort of like pinnacle moment where Judith is decapitating Holofernes to liberate her people, and there's the example from Switzerland has the scalloped border on the edging. So I took this as inspiration to make a collar in silk thread in the style of Genoese scalloped collars from the 1630s that tie in the front with 5 different scallops with motifs of the lace makers and of the figures from the story. And this took me 200 hours, so 100 less than my first project, which was great because at this point I was working full-time at the museum as well. So in addition to the collar and an overhead video of the entire process of making it, we also, the curators really wanted a photo of me wearing it in the gallery because they understood that lace makers historically were not able to wear and afford their own work. And in fact, this is now in the collection of the Textile Museum in Switzerland because I too can't afford my own work, but really it's an honor to have it in their collection. So I collaborated with my dear friend Rose Callahan, who also took the photo that was my opening slide and the flyer for this talk. And she, we shot me in a photo that we titled For Artemisia, after Artemisia Gentileschi, who famously also painted the story of Judith and Holofernes. So, more recently, as I mentioned, Brooklyn Lace Guild also had our very first exhibition of our own members' work. On the left is a piece by our member Lila Klinger, who is unbelievably talented. This is in needle lace. Their work is just stunning, so please look them up. And then on the right is a piece that I displayed in progress, the relic of St. Agnes. This was just closed actually on January 11, but we are belatedly finishing our catalog, which will be available online as a PDF for free and as a print-on-demand book. So stay tuned for that, and you can see all the work by our really wonderful members in this exhibition. And hopefully there will be more chances for us to exhibit in the future. we may have something planned for next year for our 10-year anniversary, but that's all I'll say for now. So one of the most humble pieces of lace that is the most denigrated type of lace is the doily. And so, of course, being a lover of the underdog and of the neglected in terms of textile history, I really have been drawn to doilies in particular, thanks to, first of all, a poem by Elizabeth Bishop, which I won't read to you, but I have put an excerpt up here for you. It's called Filling Station, sort of questioning why some place that is dirty and filthy would have a doily in it, and realizing that this is a representation of love and of familial love and of care for someone's family. And that really, to me, is what doilies exemplify. This is a doily crocheted by my maternal grandmother, and actually, around April Fool's Day, there was a post from a museum that I will not name that was making fun of doilies, making jokes about them. And so I wrote a very angry article about it in response to it on Hyperallergic, if you're interested in my opinions about that we should respect these objects. So as part of that, I'm also working on a short book project, almost to the end here, I promise, looking at doilies from all over the world because they have their own unbelievable and incredibly diverse stories. And so often these are overlooked as sort of these frivolous objects made by bored housewives, when in reality, they're coming out of circumstances like the Irish lace makers during the famine who are, feeding their families or paying for their, immigration to the US. So one of my examples will be with Emma Welty, an Armenian artist who lives in Connecticut, who is brilliant. These are doilies that she made, and her grandmother actually was able to fund their family's flight from the Armenian genocide through the production of her needle lace doilies, which she, now Emma carries on this tradition. And there's many examples of this lace made in all over the world in all different kinds of environments. Like this is an image from the Library of Congress in Jerusalem and Palestine of lace makers in the point lace technique, which is related to the sort of Turkish knotted lace that I mentioned much earlier. There's also examples of lace. There's a crochet lace industry that I'm working on as part of my dissertation, which is on the left here. There's also women in Japanese and American internment camps during World War II that had set up classes and workshops in crochet and held an exhibition of their doilies during this time period. So this is something that was just part of their survival, quite literally, to make protective garments from the cold in Colorado, but also to fill their homes with objects that would make them feel loved. So for my dissertation project, which is another ongoing research project, but everything overlaps, as you can see. I'm working on the collection of the Mexican-American woman, Magdalena Nuttall. Her daughter, Zelia Nuttall, pictured here, is much better known. She was an archaeologist who focused on Mayan glyphs. She was the first to publish and translate them, I think. So anyway, but her mother was a lace collector, and she was really interested in gathering a very encyclopedic and global collection of lace, which they're all very fragmentary and small, so they haven't gotten a lot of attention because they're not necessarily the spectacular pieces, but that's why I'm so interested in them. So it's an 1,000-piece collection from 32 countries. This is one example of bobbin lace made in China, and the lace bark was also from her collection, and the polychrome lace was also from her collection, so you've seen a lot of her collection tonight. So last year I was able to travel to Sweden for the first leg of my research, looking at rural lace traditions that survive in northern province of Dalarna, where they still make lace in the 16th century manner with no pattern underneath, so they're just working on this striped surface on the pillow, as you can see here. So there's an example in the middle of the lace from the Nuttall collection, and then my reconstruction of that is next to it. There's just a small section of it that is the same pattern. So they're still making it to this day, which is pretty exciting. So reconstruction has become a really important part of my research. So I always want to make the things that I'm studying to understand them better. And of course, I can't just make the thing. I have to make the tool. So oops, it will not let me play this video. But so I recently took a weaving class at the John C. Campbell Folk School, where I wove my own pillow cover. So that is upcoming. All right, so But there's much more in the future. This is me just throwing as much at you as I possibly can. So just to say, to finish, I like to show these two images just to talk about what is the truth of lace-making history and what is the reality, what is fiction and what is what really happened. And the answer is that there are so many realities that are true, and that lace makers came from all walks of life, young, old, poor, wealthy, independent, cloistered, voluntary, involuntary. So they all deserve our respect and appreciation for all of the work and skill that they did into developing this. And I hope that this continues for hundreds and even thousands of more years into the future. So that is all I have for you. Thank you. And I think we can take questions. We have time. So.
Could you repeat your definition of lace?
Oh yeah. Yes. Yes. I'm sorry. I talk fast. That is my habit. Okay. Okay, so my definition, which this varies depending on the person you ask, and even mine varies depending on when you ask me, but this has been consistent for a few years, is lace is a textile in which the pattern is defined by the spaces between the threads. Which is somehow all-encompassing and yet not encompassing enough. It is very strange. It's hard to define.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
You had mentioned something about children's eyesight was better for lace making. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on some of the other ergonomic kind of things that happen.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I can take us back to an image that I didn't expand on for time that will show you a little bit of how that worked. So there is sort of a myth around lace making that lace makers would go blind or something. This also exists in other techniques, like in China they have a stitch called the forbidden stitch, and you're not supposed to do it because it'll make you go blind. But a lot of this is like PR. It's sort of like marketing to make it like, ooh, this is so hard to make that they'll go blind. Well, it is hard to make, but in fact, a lot of lace makers simply aged out of it, or honestly, once you become so skilled and experienced, you see these lace makers working really, really fast. They don't necessarily need to see what they're doing. You can feel it in your body. And you can, if you have your patterns that you've used over and over again, you can feel the pinholes with your pin. You don't have to really see them. However, there are surviving tools of how lace makers saw well. There are depictions of lace makers like Nicolas Mas, the Dutch painter that painted the mother and child lace maker, has a painting of an older woman with, I think, has glasses, who's making lace. So that was a thing. And then also, they have tools, different lighting tools. This is an English one called a candle block. And these are basically glass globes that they would be filled with light, which projects a beam of light on your lace pillow from the candle that you light in the center. And this allowed lace makers to share a single candle. Supposedly, as many as 16 on one candle block, although, again, a lot of these stories that get passed on, we don't necessarily have evidence for, and they might be a little bit exaggerated. But definitely they had the sort of tools to help them see better, and they also worked outside a lot, so in daylight. And winter hours, you'll see in convent records, for example, they're working shorter hours in the winter to save on, candles were expensive actually, and tallow candles, which were cheaper than beeswax, were smoky, and they would make their lace dirty, so they didn't use them.
Thank you. Taking care of one's hands and wrists and arms, and I'm wondering if you've ever had any issues.
That's a great question, and actually the students asked me that in my class, and they're like, how do you take care of yourself? And I'm like, I should better. Let's all look up every 20 minutes and look at a tree that's far away, or like do some eyeball exercises. But sometimes you get so engrossed and you just forget. So I actually have developed sciatica from one project that I worked very, very long and hard on, and I realized that do not cross your legs for 200 hours when you're making lace. That is bad. So I will not do that again. But it's also about having the appropriate table height and tools. The Spanish pillows are helpful. For example, my table height at home just isn't great, but I live in a tiny apartment in Brooklyn, so it is what it is. But in an ideal world, you'd actually want your pillow quite low, like just above your knee, and then you can adjust it on a stand, like sort of bend it forward and back to accommodate, and that would be a little bit better. I don't find that I have hand and wrist problems though. Like crochet and knitting and embroidery, I'll get cramps, but bobbin lace, it's like playing the piano, so I feel like I'm more like I'm flicking. I'm not, so it's not like this, kind of.
Right, I am a crocheter, so
Ah.
that's why.
That's what gives me hand cramps. Yeah, it's worse. But lace is your back, really. Bobbin lace, yeah.
So you have gone in a lot of different directions in your career, which is, I guess, the goal for most artists, in my opinion. It's the spice of life. But my question is kind of, right now, what is your, what are your goals with your PhD? Is it to do more curation in educational experiences, to do more, education out across the world, across the country? Where is your work taking you right now that you are excited about?
Oh, that's such a good question, and it's so hard because I just want to do everything all the time, which which I'm lucky to be able to do a little bit. I definitely I plan to publish my dissertation. I want to write books of my research. I want to make more work and curate shows, and so everything is the answer. But one of the goals of the things that I haven't had the opportunity to do yet that is really something that I'm focusing attention on through my PhD is more formal teaching in an academic setting. So I've given a lot of lectures and I've taught a lot of bobbin lace workshops, but reconstruction as a research methodology is a major area of my focus. It's one of my field exams that I have to take in April. And I would really like to teach that in an academic setting. So I've always felt like, why are making and history separate? They're the same thing in my brain, and I want them to be together. So that's what I want to teach in the future is establishing courses, whether elective or one-off or more formally within a single institution where those things are taught, not just lace, but all kinds of textiles in one environment.
Hi, I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the different considerations that go into following a pattern versus creating your own thing, the way that you did with the Ruth Bader Ginsburg collar.
That's a really good question. Designing for bobbin lace is really, it's a very steep learning curve. It is one of the techniques that you have to have a lot of experience in to do formally. If you are into just free form, doing your thing, you can learn a couple skills and kind of go for it. But if you would like to create a design or a repeating pattern, it took me essentially 6 years before I designed my first lace pattern. And I was not working intensively the whole time. So I would say it was really more 18 months of intensive study. Everyone has a sort of different approach. Some people are very precise. They design down to a diagram of each stitch. And there's color coding systems that were invented in Belgium in 1912. So you can follow paths of individual pairs, and the color will tell you, crochet diagrams, this is whole stitch or this is half stitch or whatever. But that's not how historical lace makers worked. They held all of that knowledge in here. And so they were given more like a drawing or an illustration, and they sort of interpreted as they went. So really the designer who maybe got all the fame and the money was more like doing an illustration, and the lace makers were actually the engineers that were executing all of this. So I kind of prefer to work that way. I also am just a little bit lazy about the design process. So I've sort of kept myself to, with the exception of the Ruth Bader Ginsburg project, not designing precise diagrams. But there's so much more resources than when I started that are online now. So, for example, there's a Patreon of the Adventurous Lace Makers. It's really fantastic. They teach a very contemporary style of lace design online that is geared towards beginners and advanced makers. So there are many different ways you can get into it. But I will say the benefit of needle lace is that it's more like embroidery. So if you can embroider and you can draw, you can design needle lace.